We are all here today to speak for the water and protect the water and renew our connection to water. Hi, my name is Paul Baines, and I'm sitting here today by the Otonabee River in the Mississauga-Anishinaabeg territory here in Treaty 20. And I'd like to speak to you all today about various water statements that have been written. I'll be speaking about the Water Declaration, the Blue Communities, Aquaphons, the NIBI Declaration, the Great Lakes Commons Charter, and a federal petition to recognize the Great Lakes as living entities as well. And so the reason I wanted to speak today with Tasha about these water intentions is to look at both the written and unwritten expressions for water connection and water protection. The People's Water Campaign is also developing a water justice invitation. So I wanted to make sure that today's webinar could help inform that process. For people like myself, a settler here, I don't really have any water teachings. And so for me, learning about these declarations and these expressions are a way to understand some more water teachings. And also many of us, including myself on this call, are still learning about how Canada's authority when it comes to lands and waters is contested by Indigenous self-determination and jurisdiction. So my guiding questions for these 6 written intentions is, whose voice is being centered? And who are these intentions written for? What do these voices teach us about water justice? How are these intentions being used towards their goal? And what kind of agency is really being animated? How are we defining what power is? So if you'll go on with me a little journey here, I'm going to go through some of these water declarations, and I'll try to answer those first 2 questions to start with, and we'll open it up for Tasha and I in discussion with the rest of you on all these questions as well. The first declaration I'd like to introduce you to was written in 2008, and it's the Water Declaration of the Anishinaabeg, Mushkegowuk, and Ongwehone of Ontario. There's several parts to it, but this was adopted by the Chiefs in Assembly by consensus. It's really about the inherent responsibilities and the intimate relationships these nations have with water. And when we speak about water, we're not just talking about, tap water or groundwater, but this declaration really opens up of all the various forms of water. It really does, like many of these declarations, recognize women as the keepers of the water, honoring the spirit through ceremonies given by the Creator. What's important about declarations like this is it reinforces the fact that these nations have their own laws and protocols, and that this care is part of a relationship with the Creator. Relationships with the Crown are also important. These are in the form of treaties, for instance. And these treaties did not, unlike many of us may have learned in television or history class, these treaties were not about handing over decision-making to the Crown. Indigenous nations are not just stakeholders. So this is an example of proclaiming, the role of First Peoples on Turtle Island, with both rights and responsibilities to protect water for present and future generations. So the document goes on with a long list of the poor conditions of these waters as they've been sort of dwindling the last 150 plus years, and that these waters are increasingly governed by foreign economic values that alienate their own relationships with each other and the waters. Lastly, I wanted to highlight the fact that this declaration is reminding us that the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples reaffirms their right to self-determination to pursue their own economic, social, and cultural development. But they also have rights given by the Creator and recognized by Constitution of Canada and international law. So that was the first declaration I wanted to introduce you to for those who didn't already know, because a lot of time when we speak about water permits or water pollution, we forget that this jurisdiction around water and territory isn't just in the sole domain of Ontario or Canada. A different kind of declaration is this Blue Communities one, and I speak to you today wearing several hats. Some of the work I do is with the Sisters of St. Joseph, and about 2+ years ago, they became a Blue Community. The Blue Communities project encourages municipalities, Indigenous communities, and even religious organizations like the Federation of Sisters of St. Joseph to support the idea of a water commons framework recognizing that water is a shared resource for all by passing various resolutions. So this was originally started by the Council of Canadians, by water warriors such as Maud Barlow. So there's three main principles to this type of water declaration, and that is to recognize water and sanitation as human rights, to ban or to phase out the sale of bottled water in municipal facilities or at municipal events. But again, this could be done for any organization. I think McGill University campus is also a blue community. And so the various blue communities can interpret and adapt these principles in their own way. Lastly, they also want to promote publicly financed, owned and operated water and wastewater services. So far there's 75 of these blue communities internationally, including Los Angeles, a First Nation in what's now called British Columbia, I won't even Pelsic Stakmek territory, one of the first First Nations in Canada to become a blue community, but also a city in Brazil and also Paris, just to name a few. There's more about the blue communities work in Maud Barlow's latest book, Whose Water Is It Anyway? Taking water protection into public hands. So here we have an example of a nonprofit organization also trying to articulate what it means to be a good water protector and how we can go about doing so. Speaking of another kind of organization, the Catholic Church recently put out a document. The Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development put out a document called Aquaphons Beate, which translates into water is a source of life. And we can see a lot of connecting themes across these various water declarations, which again, I hope we can use to discuss further in today's webinar, but also can help inform the People's Water campaign and the declaration around water justice. But here again, we're looking at ways in which we can take evangelical principles and animate them into concrete action. There are various Catholic social teachings about human dignity, the common good, solidarity, and justice to really help inform a new development paradigm. You know, we just passed the 10-year mark of the United Nations General Assembly commitment to the universal right to water and sanitation. And there's been very slow progress on that. Not only do we have over 800 million people in the world without clean, safe access to drinking water, as some of us know, there are over 100 First Nations in Canada that currently do not have this right respected either. So this document is well researched with making connections to climate change, privatization, obviously pollution of freshwaters and oceans, and again, the unjust distribution of water and democratic control. What distinguishes this water declaration from many of the other non-Indigenous declarations that I've seen is that it really does affirm water's role in ceremony and healing, beauty, and wonder, peacemaking, and really vitality across our common home. So while it also values the utility of water for human use, the Dicastery authors prefer to help readers understand a deeper and more soulful relationship with water. So they have several proposals in each of the sections. This is like a 25-page document, but basically these are many of the goals that some of the partners of the People's Water Campaign are working on in terms of plastics, human right to water. Again, third one there, really paying attention to society's most marginal. That's the language of the document. And lastly, I think it's an interesting one to think about how water protection and water care and water ceremony is an active process of dialogue and uniting people in a sort of peacemaking possibilities. I wanted to point out this declaration as well. This is the Nibi Declaration of Treaty 3. Nibi is the Anishinaabe word for water. And I think it's important to question whose language many of these intentions are written in. And obviously, language and words are not just syntax, they are windows into worlds and relationships. And so I think it's important to, if we're thinking about justice and we're thinking about repairing harm, not just protecting water, we think about the language we're using and whose language, and how can we use language to, again, open up ways of connecting. And so Treaty 3 is this large territory going from west of Thunder Bay to Sioux Lookout to the province of Manitoba, made up of 28 First Nation communities. And they developed their own water declaration. So again, pulling on various examples, different types of authorship, different types of intentions here when it comes to defining written commitments to water protection, water care, water responsibility. So again, they've actually developed a 26-page toolkit to help facilitate the meaning and the support of this document. It's really just a one-page declaration, and it was again developed by the Treaty Grand Council Treaty Number 3 Women's Council, and we'll see that theme running through this work as well as we see the leadership of women in the protection of water. So this is the declaration to guide leadership in the creation of future policy and decision-making that relate to water, and also to guide a relationship with youth, future generations, and with Nibi herself. And so I know we try to never speak about water without having water in the room. And I think it's really important to bring Nibi, to bring water into even our virtual spaces as we talk about her and we think about our connection and our responsibilities. And so these declarations are not just about human-to-human declarations, human-to-human commitments and agreements, but also human-to-creation relationships as well. So here are some of the key themes of this declaration are that water is alive and has spirit, and thus it cannot be owned or controlled. It's shared across lands and between peoples, doesn't really respect political boundaries in the current form. And again, similar to the first declaration we looked at, it has many forms, including snow, ice, spring water, salt water, and beyond. But I think it's really important to point out birth waters as one of the waters in which we need to be mindful of when thinking about our sacred and shared relationships with water. So often the colonial structures have divided water up into so many different jurisdictions. You know, there is the weather people doing the rain, I suppose. There's navigable waters, there's groundwater, there's fresh water. And these are all different ministries, different levels of government. And we can see how this fragmentation of water governance has, really made it difficult to protect water in all of its forms. And when we think about gender and we think about creation and we think about the next generation, if we include birth waters into our deeper understanding about our responsibilities to water, I personally think it helps again make those connections that for most of our indigenous histories was never broken, but has more in the Western way, in the colonial way, has been separated and been degraded as what water is and where water is. So again, water being the source of our well-being, spirituality, both physical, mental, emotional, and that we all have a sacred relationship with Nibi. Women have a special responsibility, and this relationship is preserved through ceremony and teachings shared between generations. So I wanted to, here's a quick map of, you can see here, the province of what is now called the province of Ontario. And again, this water declaration has a whole toolkit, unlike the other ones, has a whole toolkit to help implement and further its power. So bear with me, I've just got a couple more. I wanted to speak about the Great Lakes Commons Charter Declaration. Another one of the hats I'm wearing today is a person who's been involved with the Great Lakes Commons for many years. And I didn't create this charter, but in 2012, after 2 years of collaborative work, this charter declaration highlighted several, I think, key pieces which we can be reminded about as we think about this water justice campaign in Ontario. We had some Americans in the group, and so they started off this declaration with "We the people of the Great Lakes," which I think is illustrative of some of our histories. And so as you can tell from the beginning, this one is very much centering the Great Lakes as its sort of collective sort of human body, and wanting to, I guess, take the language that is normally associated with nation states, we the people of the United States, for instance, and to sort of rethink our allegiance and our citizenship to not being towards a certain state, but towards a land base, towards a territory. Here again, we see the themes of not treating water as a resource and as a source of life instead. This document stresses our responsibility and care and acting on behalf of these waters, which is easier said than done. What does acting on behalf of these waters mean? The health of the waters is intertwined with the health of ourselves and that of generations to come. And commons actually being this word which links the ideas of gift and responsibility, and how the Great Lakes are one interconnected watershed. The Great Lakes suffer from many issues, one of which being that they're so fragmented in terms of their jurisdiction. We have different provinces and different states and different countries, all responsible for different pieces of the Great Lakes. And yet they are still one interconnected watershed, but to this day, they are not really governed as one in the modern sense. This is a declaration which actually is accompanied by a set of first principles, and the two of these things form a larger whole. It's really difficult to come up with a declaration to speak with the voice of the diversity of voices that are currently in the Great Lakes. As we can always sort of see, there is a contested way, either with different language, different understandings of our role in the world, different worldviews. And so when we talk about the People's Declaration, we really need to respect the diversity of the various peoples within that, and that not everybody in Canada considers themselves Canadians, for instance. And so accompanying or putting together these first principles, which I can connect you to in the notes of the slides, again, form a larger whole, that this is an ongoing process. The key part of this Charter Declaration is really recognizing the inherent sovereignty and rights of Indigenous peoples as codified in treaties, international agreements, and really must be upheld as foundational to commons governance. This is a work in progress. If anybody has any great examples of how this is being done, I'd love to hear about it. So lastly, the document is aspirational, and it's not directed towards any governments. It is really about a sort of what are you going to do to enliven and animate this charter? So in part it reads, we join our voices in affirming the spirit and necessity of this declaration as the foundation for a renewed relationship and mode of governance. You know, there's probably about 10 different Great Lakes conferences every year about various issues, but almost none of them are about governance. They're usually about pollution control or management or monitoring, or about all the various issues. But the issue of governance is usually left off the table. And so lastly, this charter ends with, in signing this charter, we embrace our responsibility, individual and collective, to act on behalf of these waters and future generations. So we can see again some overlapping themes here with some of the declarations before. The very last written water intention I'd like to share with you as hopefully a way to inform our discussion here about how do we walk the talk, how do we put water justice into action within 2020, within all of the contested ways in which various social movements, various ways of authority are being contested, as many Canadians are waking up to realize that the Canada they thought they live in isn't what they thought when it comes to you know, popular statues of our founders of this so-called nation. And we're living through a time of tremendous change. And so this last example is a petition that was launched through the Green Party of Canada, but really initiated by Waseekam Nim, also known as Edward George. And you'll be hearing from Waseekam for the Watersheds 2020 event on September 26th. He's been doing a lot of work in this area for many years. And he's a great example of somebody who's both working in the written word and through his actions as well. And so some of us may have heard of this idea of rights of nature or personhood, but here we have another example here in this context. So this petition documents quite clearly the need for protection beyond legislation. Basically, this is for everyone's benefit, but that we can't every 4 years, you know, be reliant on various governments passing legislation. The issues of water protection need a more holistic and again, indefinite perspective. Obviously, we can talk further about that within this current system in which industry has an overriding influence and the paradigm of economic growth, that the Canadian government is fundamentally flawed to protect the Great Lakes. And so we need a different form of political power, of protection power, that isn't reliant on governments that focus on 4-year cycles and are, again, are biased towards economic paradigms. And so this is a strategy to sort of, again, don't keep doing the same types of actions expecting different results, right? So it goes on to say, we, the undersigned, Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples of the Great Lakes, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit, and citizens of Canada, so we can see the differences there, call upon the House of Commons and Parliament assembled to undertake a process by which to formally acknowledge the Great Lakes as living entities. Lastly, it calls on support for the formation of a multi-interest tribunal led by Indigenous peoples. And this was launched and opened up May 26th, 2017, and within a short few weeks received 1,522 signatures. So with the time I have left, I just wanted to summarize that each of these declarations is very different in terms of whose voice is being centered and the intentions of it. But there's lots we can learn here about what we mean by, or what we could mean by, water justice. So here we have examples of the nation, the municipality, the First Nation, the organization, the church, the treaty partner, the bioregion, and even Indigenous youth expressing their voice on behalf of the waters in these various examples that I've tried to respectfully summarize for you today. But more importantly, I think, what do these voices teach us about water justice? And then I'll hand it over to Tasha. So there's a bit of a list here I've created, and by no means is this an exhaustive list. But these are some of my takeaways looking at these 6 declarations. There can be no justice within the current colonial system. Water is this is all about sacred and gift relationships. We need to respect both responsibilities and rights, that we are the very water in which we are trying to protect. We are part of this watershed. Water has its own responsibilities. Here we think about beyond our own human utility ideas, and that water has a purpose and responsibilities given to her as well. And we need to respect that if we're going to do just water governance. All of creation and future generations matter. Centering Indigenous teachings and governance and the role of women. So these are part of this, the recentering. There can be no justice within extractive and within a growth system. That ceremony is part of governance. We need to expand, for many of us, we need to expand and deepen our understanding of what governance is. It's not just things that happen in courts or in parliaments, for instance, or even in citizen assemblies. It goes deeper than beyond than some of these forms. The province of Ontario just was asking for people's comments regarding water permits, but there's no space in these public processes to really induce and support ceremony as part of a governance work. Lastly, water comes in many forms, and we need to sort of govern water with that perspective, including, like I mentioned, the birth waters. Governance is participatory, so let's get involved here. Let's move from the abstract into action, and many more. So I want to thank everybody for listening. I hope that was useful and part of this ongoing process of uniting across differences on behalf of the water as part of the watershed. And I'm hoping that we'll also learn a lot from Tasha before we have some discussion today. So thanks for your time and your interest.